Imagine standing in a glass-walled office, high above the Chicago skyline. Your hands trembling as you realize the man you fed for $5 is the titan who owns the very ground beneath your feet. The air is thick with the scent of expensive leather and old secrets. You thought it was a small favor, a fleeting moment of pity in a cold city. But as a gold-embossed folder slides across the mahogany desk, the truth hits like a physical blow. You didn't just buy a meal, you bought a legacy. To understand how a single plate of lukewarm pancakes could dismantle a billionaire's cynicism and rewrite a young woman's destiny, we must descend into the rain-slicked neon of a Chicago midnight 40 days ago. The wind in Chicago does not simply blow, it searches. It is a restless, invisible predator that prowls the narrow alleys and wide boulevards, seeking out the cracks in one's armor, the gap in a scarf, the fraying hem of a coat, or the hidden vulnerabilities of a tired soul. On this particular Tuesday, the wind carried the biting ozone scent of Lake Michigan, a frigid warning that winter was refusing to surrender its grip on the city. Inside the Silver Griddle, a diner tucked away where the shadows of the elevated train tracks dance across the pavement. The air was heavy with a different kind of weight. It was a thick, olfactory tapestry of burnt coffee, industrial strength floor wax, and the lingering, greasy ghosts of 1,000 midnight shifts. Clara stood behind the counter, her fingers tracing the jagged, chipped rim of a heavy ceramic mug. It was a tiny imperfection she had come to know intimately over the last 3 years, a small, rough notch that served as an anchor to her reality. She was 24, but in the harsh, flickering glow of the overhead fluorescent lights, her reflection in the stainless steel coffee urn looked decades older. Her eyes, a deep, observant hazel, were rimmed with the soft, violet shadows of chronic exhaustion. She was a student by day, a waitress by night, and a dreamer in the fleeting minutes between the two. Each step she took across the linoleum floor felt like a calculated effort, her muscles protesting the 16 hours she had already spent on her feet. The diner was nearly empty, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigeration units and the distant, metallic screech of a southbound train. Then, the bell above the door let out a dissonant, tinny chime. A man entered. He didn't walk so much as he drifted, a specter of a human being pushed inside by the gale. He wore a wool coat that had seen better decades, a garment so thin and pockmarked by time that it seemed held together by nothing more than habit and memory. His hair was a wild, unkempt halo of silver, and his skin had the texture of ancient parchment, lined with the intricate topography of a long and difficult life. He chose a seat at the very end of the counter. Stool number 7. Clara watched him with a practiced, weary neutrality. In this part of the city, you learned to read people the way a sailor reads the clouds, looking for the coming storm. But there was no storm in this man. There was only a profound, echoing stillness. As he sat down, his movements were agonizingly slow, as if each joint was a rusted hinge. He didn't look at the menu. Instead, he stared at his own hands-long, elegant fingers that trembled slightly as they rested on the formica surface. "Coffee?" Clara asked, her voice a soft rasp that cut through the silence. She didn't wait for an answer before she began the ritual. The tilt of the pot, the dark, obsidian liquid swirling into the mug, the rising steam that carried the bitter fragrance of roasted beans. It was a small mercy, a hot cup in a cold world. The man looked up then, and for a fleeting second, Clara felt a jolt of something she couldn't name. His eyes weren't the clouded, defeated eyes of the many homeless who sought refuge here. They were sharp, piercingly blue, and filled with a terrifyingly lucid intelligence. "Thank you, child," he murmured. His voice was a rich, cultivated baritone, though it was currently frayed by the cold. He wrapped his trembling hands around the mug, leaning into the warmth as if it were a holy relic. Clara watched him out of the corner of her eye as she wiped down the counter. She saw him glance at the menu, the early bird special for $5.99. She watched his gaze linger on the price, And then, with a subtle, heartbreaking sigh, he looked away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of change, spreading it out with meticulous care. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, a handful of copper pennies. He counted them once, then twice, his lips moving silently. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the clock on the wall, ticking away the seconds of a life he seemed to be losing. Clara felt a familiar, sharp pang in her chest. She knew that look. She had lived that look. She had known the cold calculation of choosing between a bus fare and a loaf of bread. She looked at the man's weathered face, then at the meager pile of coins, and then out at the dark, unforgiving Chicago streets. She thought about her own rent, which was 3 days overdue. She thought about the textbook she needed for her ethics class, and then she stopped thinking. She walked over to the ticket machine and scribbled a note. She didn't say a word as she moved toward the kitchen pass-through. "Order up," she called out to the cook in the back, her voice steady. "1 early bird. Extra toast." The man looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. I didn't order food, miss. I only have enough for the coffee." Perhaps not even that. He began to gather his coins, his movements frantic and embarrassed. Clara reached out, her hand gently covering his. Her skin was warm against his icy, parchment-like knuckles. "The kitchen made a mistake," she lied, her voice a soothing melody of manufactured grace. "They dropped an extra order. If I don't serve it, it goes in the trash. And I hate seeing things go to waste on a night like this. It's on the house." The man froze. He looked at her hand, then up at her face. For a long, breathless minute, the world outside ceased to exist. There were no trains, no wind, no city, only the profound, silent exchange of 2 souls in a diner. He saw the lie in her eyes, and she saw that he saw it. But instead of pride, she saw a flicker of something long forgotten in him, a spark of hope. "You would do that," he whispered, "for a stranger who has nothing to offer but a few pennies." Clara smiled, a genuine, tired, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. "In this city, sir, we're all just one bad night away from being strangers. Eat your breakfast. It's going to be a long walk home." She knew she would have to pay the $5 out of her own pocket at the end of the shift. It was 2 hours of work. It was a gallon of milk. But as she watched him take that first shaking bite of food, she felt a richness that no paycheck could ever provide. She didn't know that from the shadows across the street, a black sedan had been idling for an hour. She didn't know that her life, as she knew it, had ended the moment she chose kindness over currency. The weeks that followed the encounter at the Silver Griddle were defined by a peculiar mounting tension that Clara could neither name nor escape. Every time the bell chimed above the diner door, her heart would perform a frantic, irregular dance against her ribs, only to settle back into a dull, disappointed thud when the newcomer was merely another weary traveler of the night. The $5 she had sacrificed for the old man's meal had left a palpable void in her meager Bajita phantom limb of a currency that meant the difference between a warm bus ride and a 3-mile trek through the slush-filled gutters of the South Side. Her boots, already failing at the seams, began to surrender to the dampness, soaking her socks with a glacial chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The city felt tighter, more claustrophobic, as if the buildings themselves were leaning inward, suffocating her with their indifferent, stony weight. She began to notice things, small, inexplicable flickers in the peripheral vision of her life that suggested she was no longer alone in her struggle. A sleek, midnight black sedan with windows so dark they looked like polished obsidian, parked 2 blocks from her walk-up apartment at 3 a.m. A man in a charcoal suit, standing across the street from the university library, his face perpetually obscured by the shadow of a brimmed hat. He never approached. He merely existed in the negative space of her daily routine, silent observer in the labyrinthine sprawl of the city. Clara's mind raced with 1,000 feverish possibilities. Was it a debt collector she didn't know? Was it related to her father's old unrecorded gambling debts that had haunted her family for years? The paranoia was a slow-acting poison, tightening her throat and making every shadow in the diner feel like a lurking threat. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. The air in the diner was particularly stagnant that day, smelling of sour milk and the metallic ozone temps of a failing ventilation system. Her manager, a man named Miller, whose skin had the grayish, unhealthy hue of wet concrete, and whose heart was rumored to be made of pure, unadulterated cynicism, cornered her near the walk-in freezer. He held a grease-stained ledger in his hand, tapping it with a nicotine-stained finger. "You're short again, Clara," he growled, his voice a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in her chest like a coming storm. $5 last month, $3 this week. You think this is a charity? You think the Silver Griddle is a soup kitchen for every vagrant with a sob story?" Clara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, a fierce, indignant spark in the middle of her bone-deep exhaustion. "I paid for that meal out of my tips, Miller. You know I did. Every cent is accounted for. I don't care who paid for what," he spat, leaning closer until she could smell the stale tobacco and cheap peppermint on his breath. "I care about the optics. This place attracts enough bottom feeders, without you rolling out the red carpet for every ghost with a hungry look in his eye. You're on thin ice, Thorne. One more mistake, one more act of misplaced heroism, and you can find another place to play. Saint, I need waitresses, not social workers." 2 days later, the ice broke. But it wasn't Miller who broke it. It was a courier. He didn't look like the usual bike messengers who darted through the frantic Chicago traffic. He was older, wearing a crisp, navy blue uniform that looked expensive enough to furnish Clara's entire apartment. He didn't speak. He simply handed her a heavy, cream-colored envelope made of paper so thick it felt like woven fabric. The seal was a drop of midnight blue wax, embossed with a logo she didn't recognize, a stylized phoenix rising from a bed of complex interlocking gears. "Clara Thorne?" the courier asked, his voice as smooth and emotionless as a machine. "Yes," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she took the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the physical weight of a different world. "A car is waiting outside," he said simply, gesturing toward the street where the black sedan sat idling like a predatory beast. "You are expected at the Sterling Tower, immediately." The drive to the downtown core was a surreal blur of rain-streaked glass and neon reflections. The interior of the sedan was a sanctuary of absolute silence, insulated from the cacophony of the city by layers of soundproofing and luxury. The scent of the leather seats was intoxicating, a mixture of expensive sandalwood, old books, and a sterile metallic cleanliness that made Clara feel like a desperate intruder in a temple of wealth. She looked down at her uniform, the faded polyester apron she hadn't had time to remove, and felt a wave of profound, agonizing self-consciousness. She was a smudge of soot on a pristine white canvas. As the car pulled up to the Sterling Tower, a monolithic spire of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the very belly of the clouds, the gravity of the situation finally settled over her, like a leaden shroud. This was the heart of the Chicago financial district, a place where fortunes were made and destroyed in the time it took to draw a single breath. The lobby was a cathedral of white marble, the floor polished to such a high gloss that it felt like walking on the surface of a frozen lake. The air was filtered and carried the faint electric hum of immense invisible power. She was escorted to the elevators, not the public ones, but a private bank tucked behind a wall of frosted glass. The security guard, a man with the stoic, unmoving face of a granite statue, swiped a gold-plated keycard. "Floor 88, he said, his voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. "The chairman is waiting for you." The ascent was a sensory assault. The elevator didn't just move. It surged upward with a silent, inexorable force that made the world below vanish. Clara felt her stomach drop, her ears popping as the atmospheric pressure shifted. Through the glass back of the elevator, the city began to shrink into a miniature model of itself. The bustling streets became narrow, glowing veins. The cars became tiny, scurrying beetles, and the great gray expanse of Lake Michigan expanded until it filled the entire horizon. She felt smaller than she had ever felt in her entire life. She was a girl from a diner, a girl who scrubbed grease and counted copper pennies, being hauled into the stratosphere of the global elite. What did they want? Had the old man been a criminal? Was she being implicated in something far beyond her comprehension? The suspense was a physical weight, pressing against her lungs until she could barely draw breath. When the doors finally slid open with a soft, melodic chime, she found herself in a hallway lined with original Impressionist paintings, their colors vibrant and defiant against the minimalist gray of the walls. At the end of the hall stood a set of double doors carved from dark, ancient oak. As she walked toward those doors, her heartbeats were the only sound in the world's low, heavy thuds that seemed to count down the final moments of her old life. She reached out, her hand hovering over the cold brass handle. This was the threshold. Behind these doors lay the answer to the mystery that had been haunting her for 40 days. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of expensive ozone filling her lungs, and pushed. The office was vast, a glass-walled island in the sky, and there, silhouetted against the burning orange glow of a Chicago sunset, stood a figure. He wasn't wearing a tattered, pockmarked coat anymore. He was draped in a suit of charcoal silk that fit him like a second skin. But as he turned around, the piercing, intelligent blue eyes remained the same. "Hello, Clara," the man said, his voice no longer frayed by the winter cold, but commanding, resonant, and filled with an inscrutable warmth. "I believe I still owe you for the extra toast." The shock hit her like a physical tidal wave. She felt the floor beneath her sway, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight of the revelation. This wasn't a vagrant. This wasn't a man who couldn't afford a meal. This was Arthur Sterling, the man whose name was etched into the very steel of the building she stood in. The founder of a global empire. The ghost she had fed in the dark. The silence that saturated the 88th floor was not the empty silence of a vacant room. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet, the kind that precedes a tectonic shift in the Earth's crust. Clara stood paralyzed, her breath hitching in the back of her throat as she stared at the man who had been a ghost in a tattered coat and was now a titan in silk. The orange light of the setting sun bled across the floor, turning the white marble into a sea of liquid fire. Arthur Sterling didn't move. He simply watched her, his gaze holding a terrifyingly gentle weight. In that moment, Clara felt the entire architecture of her reality begin to crumble. The grease-stained menus, the late-night shifts, the constant gnawing fear of a bank balance that never quite reached 3 digits, all of it felt like a dream she was finally waking from. You were there," she finally whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast, echoing space. "You sat on stool 7. You didn't have enough for the coffee." Arthur smiled, a slow, bittersweet expression that softened the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face. He walked toward the massive glass windows, looking out at the city he had helped build, a sprawling, concrete testament to human ambition and greed. "I spent 40 years building an empire, Clara," he began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of her boots. "I climbed the ladder, rung by bloody rung. I learned how to calculate risk, how to leverage debt, and how to spot a lie from 1,000 miles away. But somewhere in the middle of all that success, I realized I had lost something far more valuable than the billions in my accounts. I had lost the ability to see the human soul." He turned back to her, the light catching the silver in his hair, creating a halo of incandescent brilliance. "I wanted to know if the world I had helped create was still capable of producing a person who would do something for nothing. I wanted to see if kindness still existed in the wild, away from the cameras of charity galas and the strategic tax write-offs of the elite. So, I put on my father's old coat. I walked into the coldest parts of this city. I sat in 12 different diners over 12 different nights. I told the same story. I showed the same empty pockets. He paused, a momentary shadow of old grief passing over his eyes. In 11 of those places, I was ignored. In 3, I was asked to leave before I could even sit down. One manager even called the police because I looked untidy. Arthur stepped closer, his presence commanding yet strangely humble. And then I walked into the Silver Griddle. I sat at your counter. I saw the exhaustion in your eyes, the kind of tiredness that goes deeper than sleep can reach. I saw you counting your own pennies, and yet, when you looked at me, you didn't see a vagrant. You didn't see a nuisance. You saw a human being who was hungry. He reached out and picked up a heavy, midnight blue folder from the desk. The movement was agonizingly slow, a cinematic ritual of transformation. He held it out to her, the golden-bossed phoenix shimmering in the twilight. You didn't just give me a meal, Clara. You gave me back my faith. You reminded me that even in a city made of steel and ice, there is still a warmth that can't be bought, but it can be rewarded. Clara's hands shook as she took the folder. The leather was cool and smooth, smelling of old libraries and expensive possibilities. She opened it, her eyes blurring with tears as she tried to make sense of the documents inside. There was a letter of intent for a full-ride scholarship to the university of her choice, every tuition fee, every textbook, every meal paid for in perpetuity. Beneath that, a deed to a small, elegant brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined street she had only ever seen in magazines. And finally, a contractor position as the executive director of the newly formed Sterling Foundation for Urban Grace, with a salary that made her heart stop. I can't accept this, she stammered, the words catching on the lump in her throat. It was just $5. It was just a plate of pancakes. It wasn't worth all of this. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and grounding. Kindness is the only thing in this world that doesn't follow the laws of mathematics. Clara, it doesn't divide, it multiplies. That $5 was the last of your hope, and you gave it to a stranger. To me, that makes it the most valuable investment I have ever seen. You have a rare gift, the ability to see the invisible people. This city needs more people like you in positions of power. I'm not giving you a gift. I'm giving you a platform. The realization hit her then, not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, rising tide of profound understanding. Her life was no longer a series of desperate maneuvers to survive until the next Tuesday. The weight of the world, the rent, the tuition, the crushing loneliness of the struggle was simply gone. It was replaced by a different kind of weight, the responsibility of the light she now held. She looked out the window at the flickering lights of Chicago, thinking of the thousands of people currently sitting in diners, counting their change, wondering if anyone saw them. Weeks later, Clara returned to the Silver Griddle one last time. She didn't arrive in a black sedan, and she didn't wear her expensive new suits. She wore her old coat and her worn-out boots. She sat on stool 7 and ordered a black coffee. When Miller, the manager, approached her with his usual scowl, she didn't flinch. She simply handed him a check enough to buy the diner 3 times over. I'm making some changes here, Miller, she said, her voice steady and filled with a new, unshakable authority. First, we're fixing the heat. Second, we're putting a sign in the window that says, "No one eats alone." And third, you're fired. As she walked out into the crisp Chicago air, the wind still blew, but it no longer felt like a predator. It felt like a companion. She understood now that the smallest acts of grace are the true architects of our destiny. We often think we are waiting for a miracle to change our lives, a lottery win, a sudden promotion, a stroke of luck, but the truth is much more profound. We are the miracles. Every time we choose to be kind when we are tired, every time we give when we have nothing, we are rewriting the story of the world. Clara looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to pierce through the city's orange glow. Her journey was just beginning, but she knew the way. For she had learned that in the grand tapestry of human existence, there are no small acts. There is only the inexorable ripple of love, expanding outward until it touches every heart in its path. Does the world truly reward the kind, or was Clara just the exception to a cruel rule? Perhaps the answer lies in your own hands the next time you see a stranger in need. Will you look away, or will you offer the extra toast? Remember, the person you help today might just be the person who holds the key to your tomorrow. Subscribe to Gilded Scraps, and let us know in the comments, have you ever experienced a random act of kindness that changed your life? Your story might be the next one we tell.